Okay, the little red light is on. And that means if you're hearing this, we have been brought together. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. If you're new, welcome to you and everyone else. What is up? Oh my gosh. We all know what's up. Things are starting to slowly get more and more political in a way, it seems, right? To wear the mask or not wear the mask. And I don't know where you are in my state of Pennsylvania. As I think I said last week, they are starting to reopen in stages, parts of the state. And I just think that a lot of people are looking at the numbers and saying, this is how many people died where I live. And they're looking at, oh, these people are all older than me. And then they feel like, wow, did we just destroy our whole economy and people's businesses and lives unnecessarily? And then there's the other folks who are like, you're placing your privileged life over other people's. And I have been sort of avoiding having some direct conversations about that on the show because I just didn't want to get into stuff. I don't want to get into too much controversy. I don't think that I can emotionally deal with like a barrage of emails or, like some of you might remember the beginning of this year was really rocky. And I needed to personally take care of myself. And so that meant not putting my foot in anything right now, And I've just been careful about who I'm having conversations with and bringing on the show because I don't want to get into anything too sticky. I should say, though, that just a couple days ago, I recorded a talk with Derek Beres where I did kind of get into it some. Not bad, but in a good way because Derek wrote this article about conspiracy theories and that Plandemic movie, and I've decided I wanted to try to have some conversation about it. And it went really well, and I just recorded it like 2 days ago. It'll come to you next week. But it's kind of the first time I'm letting myself get a little bit more into some controversial topics here. So just to mention that that's going to happen next week. This week, though, I'm talking with Mel Russo, and the conversation you're going to hear today with Mel is really what I'm needing, which is like feeling of friendship and camaraderie. Like Mel and I go way back, you'll hear. She opened her center right around the same time I did. She ended up closing hers just a few years before me and went to work for YogaWorks, which we talk all about. I had no idea she had such an inside track on what was happening with YogaWorks. She shares a whole bunch of stuff, you'll hear. But more than anything, I just really enjoy talking to Mel. Speaking with her made me recall like the initial reasons why I got into yoga, like the reasons why I care about it. And that just felt really good to have that reaffirmed with an old friend. So I'm so glad that we connected after all these years, and I'm excited for you to hear it today. Before we do, let me just mention a few of my things. First, I don't know if you knew this, but I have this new podcast I started like 2 months ago called Jay Brown Yoga Thoughts. And I thought I would mention again if you didn't know about it. Essentially, it is a celebration of 10 years of blog writing. I've been writing 800 words a month for the last 10 years, and I decided to go back and record them all, and it's been really, really fun to do. And actually informative for me to reflect on everything that has happened up until now. And sometimes I'm kind of cringy, it's like my older versions of me, but I really have been enjoying putting them out. And if you haven't checked it out yet, I want to encourage you to do so. You can find it wherever you find podcasts. It's called Jay Brown Yoga Thoughts. Do check it out and subscribe. Also, This episode is brought to you in support from Podcast Premium subscribers Valerie Midget and Joan Roach. Becoming a Podcast Premium subscriber not only gives you full access to the archives, but it is the best way to help support and sustain this show. We're so grateful to everyone who's doing that. Thank you, Valerie and Joan. You can find out more about becoming a Podcast Premium subscriber, along with just finding all of my stuff, at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, I think that's it. My conversation with Mel was nice and long and full, so I decided to keep this short and to the point. I will touch base with you on the other side, but for now, let's just go ahead and get to this. Let's listen to this conversation I had with Mel Russo.
Hey, Jay.
Hey, Mel.
Oh, my God. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
Considering the world today, I'm doing pretty good.
Yes. The world today is different than even just a few months ago.
I know. But I'm adjusting.
Yeah. In ways that, I don't know, some good, some bad, maybe.
Yeah, that is true. I don't love all the things that we have to do now, but I accept them.
Well, Mel, I have to say, I already feel good or comfort by talking with you. And it's something that's been happening a lot, where like old friends who I haven't seen in years are like sending me notes or showing up to my Zoom classes, you know?
Oh, yeah. And I've had a bunch of people from Yoga High. In fact, my Zoom classes now are probably roughly 50% Yoga High, my yoga studio, and then 50% Yoga Works, the two places I taught.
Yeah. And I was going to just say that's, you know, when I think of you, you had Yoga High. I think you opened it in 2008?
Exactly, yeah.
Right. And so I opened mine in 2007.
Ah.
And I think I might have made it a little bit longer. You went to when? 2015? Is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Cause you were in the city, which was way harder to keep at least.
Oh God. And we had moved Liz and I like to say, like, our big demise was deciding to move to another location, which at the time seemed to make sense because we only had one room in our original location on Clinton. Mm-hmm. And we were doing teacher trainings, and our class, we were just sort of growing out of that space and thought, well, it's time for two spaces. Mm-hmm. And we moved a couple of blocks south and west, and you know, who knew that people can't cross Delancey to practice yoga?
Well, that's a thing about just like the routes that people would walk and foot traffic sometimes.
Yes.
You know?
I know, I get it, but you know, the people that follow their teachers. Like, if you've got
That's true. And I will say this though, I mean, by the time you made the move, it was somewhat later. Again, I lived on Clinton and Stanton for 12 years.
Wow.
I had an apartment in the basement apartment in Clinton and Stanton. It was $450 a month for like the first 6 or 7 years. And then it went up to $600 a month, and it stayed there until I left.
Wow, that's great.
And at that time, when you had a rent like that in Manhattan, you could be an artist. You didn't have to make a lot of money. You could have a yoga studio.
I know it. And actually, and not many people did. You know, when Liz and I opened Yoga High, the only yoga studios downtown were Golden Bridge, the Kundalini one, which had been there for years, and Yoga Works had also opened up the same year as us.
Right. Well, I was thinking back. I know I knew you before we both opened our places.
Oh, East.
Was it East Yoga? That was the name I was trying to remember. That was Was that Kari's place?
Yes. In fact, for like a
Yes.
minute, I was your boss.
Oh, that's right. You
Yeah,
took
because
it over. Been there
yeah,
for
I
a second.
managed it. Yeah, and that happened very quickly. That was my very first teaching gig, and I think within the first 2 or 3 weeks of teaching, Kari, who just was not interested in running it the way that you need to run a yoga studio, just said, "Do you want to manage it?" Because I think I do come across as pretty bossy. And as someone, I mean, I definitely am aware of that. And I think it was obvious that I care so much about the space and the students and the whole thing. And she said, "Would you want to be the manager?" And I said, "Hell yeah." And I loved every minute of managing that studio. I loved it.
Well, I got to say that studio that was so old school. I mean, it was
I
really the teachers
know.
ran the show. I mean, it was basically what I modeled my place on, what I'm sure you modeled your place on. Like
Yeah, exactly. Very community oriented, and the teachers are the heartbeat.
and I think I'm indulging us in this moment of remembering that time in the New York yoga scene. And people are probably like, oh no, Jay's going on about the New York yoga scene again.
I
But
know, but it was
it was
so
it
different.
was a golden time because it felt like you had a lot of freedom to do things, and there was people
Yeah.
showing up to classes. And
And it wasn't, I joke with some of my students now that you'd have to put flyers up or walk around the neighborhood with paper in your hand to get
right,
people
but it
to come
worked.
to
If you did
studio.
that, you
Yeah.
got people. That's the
Yeah.
thing.
It really did. And
Yeah.
emails, people were big on emailing back then. And they
Mhm.
still are. I still do a lot of communicating through email, but the social media has added a completely different.
So how long had you, I know you were like born. See, I read that you were born in New York, right?
Yes, Lenox Hill Hospital.
Okay. And then in 1995, you went to Los Angeles. Is that right?
I did. I moved to LA just for something different, and I had friends out there from college. And I moved to LA, and that's when I started practicing yoga. When I moved to LA, I'd
See,
never practiced before that.
I was in LA and then I moved to New York in 1994. So we went,
Oh,
we crossed. But then, so in Los Angeles, where did you
oh,
go? Did you go to like Monty and Chuck, or where were you going?
no, I didn't even know. I had nothing to do with Yoga Works back then.
Yeah.
I started practicing at a place called City Yoga, which is owned by two wonderful people named Anthony Benanti and uh, Sue Elkin, I think. I'm not recalling her last name, but they were both John Friend disciples.
Oh, okay.
So it was like the start of the Anusara
Uh,
thing. And
yeah.
it's really funny because when I started practicing there, like most people, I became completely addicted and I was going 6 days a week and I loved it. I was always the first in line at 7 a.m. for class. I couldn't wait. And if somebody were to say to me, "What style of yoga do you practice?" I would have had no idea. I would have just said hatha, because remember back then
Yeah,
everything was
yeah.
hatha vinyasa.
If you didn't align with a particular school, you just said hatha.
Yeah, and I had no idea that it was an Anusara, air quotes, type of studio. I definitely noticed early on, that's weird. They talk about their teacher a lot in a kind of culty way, but I didn't use the word cult in my mind because back then it wasn't that much in the vernacular, the word cult and yoga.
Mm-mm. But we definitely had those like guru dudes, and John Friend was
Yes.
like the American made
Oh, yeah.
guru
And
dude.
his name came up at least 5 times per class. It was always my teacher says, my teacher this. And I didn't register as anything to me except like, oh, that's funny. They talk about this guy a lot. But that was it. And it wasn't until years later that I was like, oh, that's what was going on with those people. But I loved that studio, City Yoga, which, funny enough, Yoga Works eventually bought way after I left. But I was going to City Yoga practicing with Sue and Anthony and loving every minute of it. And then I discovered Max Strom, who ended up becoming my ultimate teacher. And every Saturday I would drive to Santa Monica and take this class at a dance studio. And back in the day, it was you just put money in a pot
Right.
and you piled in. And I think someone I was dating at the time told me about it. And I went one Saturday, and I could not believe how incredible I felt in that space with him and 700 other people.
They were big. They were that big.
Yeah, it was huge. It was huge. And
Mm.
I just, the energy of it. And, I don't know how well you know Max Strom.
I've seen him speak a few times. I should get him on the show. That's I've never haven't thought about him in a while, but he's still
Oh,
around
yeah.
doing his thing. And yes, he's quite a figure.
Yes, his energy is it's mesmerizing. I mean, if he was, disturbed, he would have been the perfect cult leader, but he's not. He's thankfully
Careful
he's
there.
I know,
Careful
thankfully he's
there.
perfectly normal, and that was never. I remember when he became my teacher a few years later, and I referred to him as my guru when I was sort of just testing out the word, not really understanding what it meant. And he looked at me, he said, "You know what? Please don't call me your guru. I don't want to be anybody's guru." And I was like, "Oh, okay." Not real. Now I realize how heavy that word is.
Yeah, yeah,
At the
yeah.
time, I was just being like, "Oh, I practice yoga, and he's my guru."
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
he was very quick to say, "Don't. You shouldn't use that word."
Interesting. Wow. So,
Yeah.
okay. So that was, and what were you doing in LA other than taking yoga
Oh,
classes?
I was working in casting. I worked in Hollywood.
Oh my
I had a
gosh.
crazy job working in casting, but I would take classes at City Yoga at 7 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
And I would drive from the studio. I'd grab my coffee, put it in my car, and drive to the office and just do casting all day.
I see. And so how long were you in Los Angeles?
I was only there for 5 years. I was
Okay.
from 95 to 2000, and I should have left in 97 because
That's so funny.
I
I was
mean,
there for 5 years, but I should have left after two.
because it was 1997 when I started hating it to the point where all I did was complain about how LA was so lame. LA
Yeah.
sucked. It's
Yeah.
not like New York. And
See, because
my
that's what I was thinking. That's so funny because I grew up in Los Angeles. It's the only other place I know
right, that's
besides New
right.
York. Spent the first whatever 17 years of my life there, and then I moved to New York, and I spent the rest of my life over here. And I did move
Yeah,
back to San Francisco at one time for like, I don't know, 7 months. But I just, to me, they're very different places, and I know wonderful people in both of those places. But I feel
yeah.
like, I don't know, if you're, from what I know of you, I would imagine that you would not necessarily group with LA, but I don't know. Maybe I'm
No,
wrong.
no. My first year, I loved it. That's when I discovered yoga. That's when I was working in Hollywood, and it was so exciting for me. And I had a wonderful boyfriend at the time. And I had two or three friends from college who were from LA and who were living there. So I had a really nice network of friends, and I made lots of friends. I worked at Mad TV. That was my very first job.
Oh, that's cool. That's fun.
Yes, and the first season of Mad TV when it was really funny with a fantastic cast.
All right.
And I was a production assistant on Mad TV my first year, and I loved it. I That was one of the best years of my memory
Hmm.
as an adult. And then it just went south in 1997-ish, and I just became very unhappy and just wanted to get out. And I think, like a lot of people, it takes a long time to really make that change in your life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, just you say, because I am such a New Yorker, and the biggest thing for me that bothered me about LA is it felt like there was no pulse, which
Mm. Oh, I know what you
like it
mean. I know
just
what you
there's
mean.
a deadness in the air that actually and I know this sounds horrible because now I love LA and I visit it all the time, and my husband keeps saying, he's also a born and raised New Yorker, but he keeps saying he wants to retire in California, and my sister wants to retire in California, so I may end up going back to California someday.
Depends
But
on
at the
where. Depends on
time,
where you are in California. But
yeah, of course. Yeah, it definitely depends. But that's what made me really sad, is that feeling of just no energy and no pulse. And I'd come back to New York, and as soon as the plane, and I came back twice a year, and as soon as the plane landed, I just got this jolt of energy. I mean, it's the only word I could think of. And I was so much happier in New York. And after 3 years of me saying how much I hated it. My friends saying, "Oh God, just get." Wait, can we curse on this
Yeah,
podcast?
you can cuss all you
Oh,
want.
oh, good, oh, good. My friends just saying, "Just get the fuck out if you are so unhappy." And
Yeah.
finally, I mean, I won't get into the catalyst that got me out, but I did eventually leave in 2000, and that's when I decided to do a teacher training after coming back to New York. I never thought about being a teacher when I lived in LA. It did not even occur to me to go into teaching yoga.
hmm But 2000 in New York City, I'm trying to think back. Like the first
Oh,
trainings were, I did my training in '97 with Allison,
oh wow.
and I think that by that time, it still was such an early time. It was a really
Yeah, in fact, it's funny. So I first got back to New York, and a friend of mine who was a manager, she managed comedians, and we were friends. She was just like me, where she was a New York, LA person, and she would come back to New York a lot. And when I got back, she said, "Oh, I've got a place for you to practice." Because I was like, "Where am I going to practice yoga? There's no city yoga in Manhattan." And she went to Sal Anthony's movement salon.
yes.
Remember that?
I haven't heard that name in so
I
long.
know.
Oh
And
my
Elena
god,
Brower
was teaching
was
a bunch
she
of
was
people there.
teaching there,
Yes.
and she was an Anusara teacher. And I remember it being like, "Oh, well, I practiced that same style while I was in LA. I'll just go right back into it, and I'll go to Sal Anthony's." So
Sal Anthony's movement
yes,
salon. It was so funny. It was like some Italian guy who just, was like investing his money in buildings and businesses,
gyrotonics. Remember his big thing was
gyrotonics.
gyrotonics.
And that actually became
Yeah.
well, like when I got my space in Brooklyn, my landlord was like an Italian guy. And I think one of the reasons he chose me to be a tenant is because of Sal Anthony. He kind of set a
Oh
precedence.
God, that's funny. That's funny. Well,
So
back
funny.
then the only studios really were Sal Anthony's, Jivamukti,
Right.
and then this mysterious place called Bava,
Well, yeah, Bava was
which
an offshoot that happened a little bit later.
yes,
But
no,
yes.
yeah, and I remember there was a woman who. This is so funny because my life is so connected to Bava teachers even before I knew it. Because I was practicing at Sal Anthony, and there was a teacher who subbed one day, and I really liked her class, and we were talking afterwards, and I said, "Oh, where else do you teach?" She said, "Oh, I teach at this studio down in the East Village called Bava." And I said, "Oh, I should check it out." She's like, "Yeah, I just should tell you it's very hippie. Like they don't really wash their blankets, and it's." And as soon as she said that, I was like, "Ew, no, thank you." And I ended up never going. But
Yeah.
then fast forward to Diana Gasparoni, who later on
hmm
became now a very good friend of mine. She was a teacher at Bava. Liz, who went on to become my business partner, was a teacher at Bava. Kari
Skylar,
taught
I
at
talked with Skylar
Skylar.
Grant. Yeah,
Exactly.
about
Skylar taught
Bava.
at
Yeah.
Bava. I mean, it's so funny how many people
It's because it
taught
was,
there.
what Peter, right? His name is Peter,
Yeah,
right? Peter
yeah.
Rizzo. Peter Rizzo. He was a
Yes,
teacher at Jiva. I think both of
yes.
us had practiced there, and then he opened that place over there off of Sixth and whatever it was, B
Yeah.
Six and B or
Between
whatever,
B and C.
right? He turned out to be a real problem. He was an early one of those guys who was crossing those
He
boundaries,
was.
right?
And I talk about that with fellow yoga teachers that back then we
There was
just
no conversation about
and
it.
there was no language for it. We would just be like, "Oh, he's creepy," and then we just wouldn't go to the person's class.
Well, I had left that place before I really heard about that. But
Yeah.
I remember talking with some about it later and them saying something about him doing his private lessons and people coming out and saying something and then a bunch of teachers leaving because of that. I do remember that happening, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how detailed you want to get into
I don't know. Like,
some of my.
did you know the
No,
details?
I didn't. Well, I didn't because I didn't ever practice at Bava. I didn't even know who this man was. But Liz was involved with Bava. So when we opened Yoga High,
Mm.
we did want to have our teachers come and teach at our studio. And at the time, Peter's reputation was kind of hit or miss. He definitely had a following in the East Village, and it was still close enough to him closing Bava that if he did come to our studio, we knew we would have a lot of people very excited to see him.
Mm.
And I remember saying to Liz, I never practiced with him and I've never met him. Before we invite him to our studio, I really need to spend some time with him.
Mm.
So Liz and I went to Vermont and spent a weekend at his place in Vermont practicing yoga and just talking. And I remember the one thing I had always heard about him is that his adjustments were a little too much, which I think was true of many Jivamukti teachers. They would just, a couple of notches too heavy on the adjustments, and some of them may be inappropriate. I remember saying to him, when you come to our studio, you cannot adjust students the way that you normally do. You cannot lie on top of a student in Paschimottanasana. You have to make sure that you know about students' injuries, because Liz and I were very good at making sure that every one of our students felt like, and this was even before there was
I'm saying this is whatever we're talking about, early 2000s, right?
Yeah, we were very progressive about that. And we had one student in particular who we knew was didn't like to be touched. In fact, when she first came to our studio, she had come up to us and told us about adjusting, and we said absolutely, we will respect that. And we made sure that every time she took class with a teacher that didn't know her, we said to the teacher, that student right there, I won't say her name, do not adjust her until you get to know her and you get permission from her. And once she got to know us, she allowed us. And we would say, is it okay if I touched you? And she would say yes. And she's gone on to, in fact, she called me the other day to tell me how much she loved my music. But she went on to be one of our most wonderful students. But she was someone where I said to Peter, like, do not touch this student at all. So we were very clear about, and it's now, like, in retrospect, I don't know. I mean, we definitely got a little bit of slack inviting him to Yoga High, given his reputation, but I guess we weren't sophisticated enough in our thinking of the ramifications of having someone like him, because it wasn't quite in the conversation as much.
Well, what I would say is that at that time, and maybe a little bit earlier, because you guys are, even that you had that conversation with him about it, that you were thinking about that, is a little bit before its time, because I remember lying on people's backs in Paschimottanasana. I did that. Yeah. We all did that. I mean, I don't know if you were, that was like a regular thing. And I remember actually being in Peter's class, not in Peter's class, actually, it was a staff meeting for Baba. And he was giving some suggestions, teaching suggestions to the teachers. And one of the suggestions is that you go around and make sure that you give everybody in class an adjustment.
Yeah.
And even back then, I was already kind of moving away from that. I was sort of like, well, what if they don't need an adjustment? Why do I have to touch everybody? Like, it was already a little bit of a question in my mind. But that was sort of the style of practice. And people liked that. People wanted that. And but then he loved it. I guess I'm not as aware. I know Skylar had mentioned it some about how, stuff came out about him at some point. And but again, at that time, we just weren't having the same conversation we're having now. It
doesn't occur to you to have these conversations, but we were very aware that he was polarizing. So we made it very clear to him. And, there were many students that were very excited that he was coming to our studio and wanted to take class with him, and the workshops that he taught, actually, if I recall, sold out because he did still have a following.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. All right, Peter. I guess I don't know what happened to him much. I guess he was up in Vermont.
He was up in Vermont, but he was part of the Me Too thing in the yoga world pretty recently.
Oh, really?
That most recent round. I know that you did a lot of that because I listened to you.
On many different levels. Yes.
Yeah, he was part of that. And, sadly, he denied it. He just continued to deny when all these women came out. And, and he did more than just inappropriately adjust people from what these women have said. And he just continued to deny it. And but he's not someone I've thought about or.
Well, it's funny because I have to say, I take very little notes about you. I was like, Mel, I can just talk to Mel. I don't need notes about Mel. But I did go to your website and I always look at whatever the bio says, just out of curiosity. And I did find some things I didn't know. But one of the things that's still in your bio is it says lots of hands-on adjustments. And I'm curious if that is still the case, because you were also just talking about, having dialogue with people. And, I was having a big conversation about that, as you know, before this whole thing hit. So I'm sort of curious of where, since we're talking about it and that was the style back then and you had it in your bio, has that changed for you at all, or what has changed, if anything?
Yes. Well, that's funny because I listened to your podcast with Alex, which then led to your podcast with Nikki about adjustments.
Right.
And I do feel very similar to Nikki when it comes to the adjustment thing. And the way that I do my adjustments now, I mean, we're talking pre-corona when I actually saw people in a yoga studio.
Yeah.
I take the temperature of what's going on, and I follow a lot of yoga teachers, and I read a lot of blogs. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I'm very in touch with the temperature of what's going on in the yoga world. And as things started shifting, when more and more students were talking about being inappropriately touched, my approach to adjusting became very different, where I would ask each student when they would come to my class. I had 3 questions where I'd say, do you practice? I would say, hi, my name is Mel. What's your name? Do you practice vinyasa yoga? Because that's the style that I taught. And this is at Yoga Works. So I'm not even talking about Yoga High because we didn't talk about that back in 2015.
Okay,
really.
So wait a second though. Then we have to go back because
let's go back
because we haven't gotten to you going to Yoga Works yet.
Oh yes.
So I'm saying. So is this just like back in the day when you had Yoga High? Were we still in that mode? I mean, you had Peter at your spot.
Yeah, I don't remember having to have conversations about adjusting with our teachers because it would never seem to be a problem. We were very respectful of our students, and we had hired mostly teachers that we had trained, and adjusting was a huge part of our teacher training. And our adjustments were very safe, and we were very clear about where you touch people and when you should not touch a person when you feel like they're not receptive to that. I don't know why we didn't have a conversation, because people didn't talk about it back then.
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm sort of probing you about, is that, again, trying to tease that out. And I hear some people in the back of my mind saying, well, that doesn't make it right. And I don't think we're suggesting that it was right. But
no, and I'm not, and clearly no one, as far as I know, I mean, who knows after this, no one has ever said that they were inappropriately touched by one of the teachers at Yoga High. For sure. I mean, there's no way. And if somebody was, and I could be not remembering, if somebody might have come up to Liz and I and said, because Liz and I had a very open door policy with all of our students, and students would talk to us about the fellow teachers. In fact, we had one student where a teacher made them cry because they were just very harsh and kind of mean. And we immediately spoke to the teacher and said, you cannot talk to students that way. You cannot tell a student that they can or cannot drink water. I think it was a situation where the student wanted to drink water and the teacher did their.
Well, I think Yoga High was kind of carrying on a baton or a long tradition of those kinds of places. It was like Jiva Mukti at the beginning, and then Bhava was an offshoot, and it was just usually 1 or 2 cool teachers who could get like a storefront space or something for not too much. And they just sort of start having classes, and you'd have teachers and students, and they develop those relationships over time. And you have,
and Yoga High was an offshoot of East. Liz and I taught at East for a couple of years, and then we left East to open up Yoga High. And most of the students that came to us at Yoga High, who were our students, already knew our style and knew that we were hands-on. And to be honest, Jay, students would tell us constantly how much they loved our adjustments. It was a constant refrain. Yeah. Your music is incredible. Your adjustments are incredible. And I love your classes. That's what we would hear about our classes at Yoga High.
Right.
And also, I have to say this, just the fact that Liz and I were both women, I think there's something a little bit safer.
I think you're right about that.
When you're a female
and
yoga
I
teacher.
Would also say is you, maybe because of that experience you had with Max Drum that you shared, you were never presenting yourself
Oh
in
God,
that
no.
kind of way, even,
No.
like you certainly have a charisma. I think sometimes people talk about charisma like it's a bad thing. And I don't think it's a bad thing, but it wasn't, you were always, again, from all the times I've ever interacted with you, we were, I think that one generation after the people who went and met all the gurus,
Exactly. And also, I've always been skeptical about guru and worship, and I've also always been fascinated by cults. And I remember just going back to practicing on Usara. I remember when I moved to New York and I started practicing with Elena, who was still very involved in the Anusara world. Mm-hmm. And I remember John Friend was coming to town to do one of his immersions, where you pay him hundreds of dollars to be in a room with like 600 other people. And I remember I took it with a friend of mine who also practiced with Elena, and we were so excited to take her teacher and just to see. We wanted to just go a little deeper into our practice. And that very first day we walked in and we were like, this place is weird. And we both watched and said, and she's now a psychotherapist. It wasn't at the time. I think she was getting her MSW at the time. I can't recall. Yeah, she was actually. But we both noticed that it was a little weird and a little culty. And that's when I said, okay, this is not really my thing. And at that point, Elena had gone on to move into her own studio. She'd moved to Soho.
Right.
And I didn't want to be a part of that. So I stayed back.
You can see that's when it did turn. And I've talked about some other people who were more on that inner circle in Anusara as well, how it sort of started out as one thing and then it got big and it became another thing. And at some point it took that turn and it got big like that and became that cult of personality, and it turned a lot of people up.
Yeah. And I think for people who are hyper aware of cult-like behavior like I am, you just notice it. As soon as you walk into the room, you notice it. And then there are people who don't have that sense that someone like me has, that it wouldn't register to them. It would just register as, oh, I love this community, because it was a beautiful community.
Well, but you see, I wonder though, I mean, I guess maybe that's naive thought, but I wonder if the same stuff that was working back then wouldn't work now.
Oh, yeah.
Because it also was about that time and that place, that yoga was kind of on this upward trajectory. People didn't really know what it was. It became kind of culturally cool and hip. I remember Vogue magazine one year, like one of the top 10 coolest things of the year was to have a private yoga instructor.
Yeah. And there were not that many options back then. Mm-hmm. Like I said, in New York, I mean, you could probably count on two hands how many yoga studios there were in New York in 2007.
And even when they did start to be a lot of them, because at some point a lot of people opened, but there wasn't Yoga Works yet. See, there wasn't.
No, it wasn't until 2008 that they came.
That's right.
And
right around when you opened Yoga High.
Yeah, I remember I was not that familiar with who Yoga Works was when we opened Yoga High. And I do remember Liz saying, oh no, Yoga Works opened up a studio in Soho. And I remember thinking, oh,
well,
God,
they came in and opened like 3 all at once. I remember they did Yoga Works East, Yoga Works West.
Yeah, when some
North
of the
and Soho was South, like they did 4 of them, if I recall, because they took Yoga Zone over, right?
That's true. Yoga Zone, and then
there was another one upstate. Yeah, B Yoga. Well, yeah.
And then they had the one on the Upper East Side. That was their longest one, if I recall. Although Westchester, no, I just found out recently that Westchester had been around for 20 years.
Huh. But you see, we have to counterpoint that with the simple fact that there are no more Yoga Works in New York City right now.
I know.
And there's no Jivamukti in New York City.
I know. I mean, even though that one was...
Oh my gosh. Who would have thought? Could you... in those years, those would be... it's crazy.
I know. It is so crazy.
So, okay, so when...
And there's no Om. Sorry, just going Om.
Om, but you see, I had reconciled that one. That was one of the early ones, and I had Cindy Leon, and we talked about, once again, the story of the leases.
Yeah.
The leases and the landlords, and how much shelf life a place like you opened and a place like I opened could have, depending on.
I know. And I do still know people who own studios, and I'm sure you've talked to many of them, and it really is a just month to month. It's exhausting, and you're not always making it work financially.
I don't know how many centers there are in Manhattan. Although I have to say, and I mean, maybe this is just wishful thinking too, but you got to think that when we get to emerge from this quarantined life, that maybe the rent's got to be cheaper. Like maybe you got some negotiating power. Like maybe it's a little bit more like the older days because of that or something.
Yeah. And that was a topic that came up when we were having our big final Zoom call with the CEO.
Wait a second. Wait, let's not get you just jumped too far ahead. Let's go back to then. Okay. I want to hear that. I want to get there, but I also want to hear about when the closing of Yoga High happened and that transition. Because I made that transition only like 3 years ago in 2017.
Yeah.
I made the transition, but I want to hear you were 2 years before me.
Well, so we were on Clinton Street from 2008 for 5 years. What is that? 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And then we decided to move to a larger space, 2 rooms on Forsyth, not that much further away.
Yeah, but the other side of Delancey. And I guess there's a psychological thing or something, right?
I don't know how well you remember Forsyth, but it's not the prettiest street. And Clinton was a gorgeous street.
Mm-hmm.
So not the prettiest street. The closest subway, I believe, was the B&D on Grand and Forsyth, or Grand and Christie, not a stop that many people are familiar with. So we decided to move. And when we had moved, it was becoming very clear with Liz and I that she was not quite as in love with it as I was. Like her life was changing. She had a child. I can't remember how old. I think her kid was just as her son was. He was definitely a toddler. And she lived way out in Brooklyn. And it was just becoming harder and harder for her to spend as much time as you need to spend when you own a yoga studio.
Mm-hmm.
And she we knew that first year on Forsyth, she was not happy and was not loving it. And I didn't love it as much as Clinton, but in my mind, I didn't really have a plan B. And I remember we met with our accountant at one point, and we were talking about the possibility of Liz leaving and the possibility of Yoga High closing. And I remember the accountant saying, what's your plan B? And I froze and I just said, oh my God, I don't have one.
I know. Me neither. I didn't have much of a plan B either.
This is what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I loved it so much. And so after that first year on Forsyth, Liz and I had a conversation, and we always had a fantastic, she's still one of my closest friends, and we had a fantastic friendship. We had a fantastic working relationship. We were great communicators, and we had a sit down, and she just said, I just don't think I can do this anymore. I still would love to teach, and I would love to be a yoga teacher here if you'll have me. And of course I would. She's a great teacher, and I loved her. But she said she just didn't want to do the day-to-day owning. And I thought, okay, I guess I'm going to just own it on my own, which definitely scared me, but I was so invested at that point. So Liz left after that first year on Forsyth, and that last year on Forsyth, I took on a manager, Patricia, who was one of our teachers, who, funny enough, Patricia was my Karmi when I taught at East Yoga. And then
you got a lot of those. I have someone in my teacher's class.
I know.
Jennifer, she's like, I mentioned you. I was like, I'm going to reach out to Mel. I want to talk to her. She's like, oh my God, she was my mentor. And so you got a lot of folks who
it's funny. Oh, that's very sweet. Thank you. Yeah. So Patricia followed us to Yoga High, and she was doing a training with Lisa Matkin at the time, and then ended up becoming a teacher for us, and a fantastic teacher. She is one of the most brilliant people. She could have gone on to be probably a neurosurgeon. She's so smart. And she became one of our teachers. And she also became one of our friends. Liz and I had a group of teachers that taught for us, but also became our friends. And we had a really nice working and friendly relationship. And when Liz left, I reached out to Patricia, or maybe even Liz suggested, why don't you see if Patricia wants to step up in some managerial way, because she was also always giving us really great advice, because it was very collaborative. I mean, I can't say, oh, Liz and I ran it by ourselves. We had a lot of teachers who gave us a lot of great
You knew
advice.
The person who was signing your checks, and you could talk to them. I mean, I remember talking to Lilia, and we just talked. We didn't have like big managerial structures necessarily between you and the people who were making the decisions.
Exactly. And also Liz and I practiced at our studio every day. We took these teachers' classes. We knew how they taught. If there was something going on, we would say, hey, let's try to figure out what's happening with your classes. And there was a lot of communication.
Yeah.
So I did end up asking Patricia, and she came on and helped me run it the last year. And
if you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.